All right, hello fellow coders, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this lesson on the for loop control structure. So in the last video we talked a little bit about the if statement as in terms of a control structure. We talked about variables a little bit, different types of variables and whatnot. So we're going to be extending all of that knowledge that we learned into the concept of using a for loop control structure. So again, a control structure is used to modify the flow of a language. Okay, again, mostly the code flows from top to bottom and left to right, but control structures will modify that flow. In the last lesson, we learned about how the if statement modifies the flow of the code in such a way that it skips lines. The for loop, for example, will be not only skipping lines, but it'll be reiterating through the same line or lines of code over and over and over again. So let's talk about the for loop and how it functions. So a for loop is, first let me start with an example, and then I'll explain the example and how the example works. So let's start with a for loop. So we'll have the word for with our round bracket. So just like with our if statement, we have our round brackets that surround the expression that is contained within that particular control structure. In this case, we're not going to have an expression, so to speak. We're going to have kind of many expressions inside of the for loop. So the for loop has three parts to it. A starting point, so let me write this down. It has a starting point, the sort of ending point, and the iterating point. I'll just put ITR because that's usually how it is written for short, and these are separated by our favorite semicolon characters that are used as sort of like a line terminating expression for the language itself, for the Java language. So a start, an end, and a way to iterate through that particular loop, because the whole point of a for loop is that it is looping. That's why it's called a loop. It goes and executes code over and over and over again. So the loop we're going to be talking about right now is a very basic one. If you've seen loops before, this is not going to be anything new to you except for perhaps the syntax, which is what I want you to pay attention to. If you've never used a loop before, then this is going to rack your mind a little bit. You might need to watch this video over and over again, but bear with me. I'm doing my best to explain this to you in as simple, plain English terms as possible. So we have a start point, an end point, and how we iterate from the start to the end. So our start point is, we're going to, typically when we use a loop, we're looping through some sort of an index. We're looping through from a starting point of, let's say 0, and we're going all the way up to another point, let's say 9, for example. So if we want to iterate from 0 to 9 and make the loop through the code over and over again from 0 to 9, how do we do that? Well, we start by, we actually we declare a variable. So the variable in this case, we're going to call it I. Okay? Now, you see we declared a variable, int I. So if you remember in the last lesson, we had declared an integer called age, int age, which represented our age. Remember that an integer is a whole number. It can be negative to positive, but it has to be a whole number with no decimals. So I'm going to assign to the value of I the value of 0. So you see here we've just done an assignment. We've declared a variable, and we've assigned a value to our variable inside of the scope of this control structure, this for loop. So it just goes to show that you can actually do a lot of things inside of one line of code. And we're going to do even more than just this inside of this line of code. So we've initialized the value of I, the variable I, which is an integer, to have the value of 0. Great. That is the starting point. We're starting at I equals 0. Now, we're going to define the end point. Okay, we have our semicolon to define, boom, we're done there. Now we want to put the end point. What is the ending point? Well, we end when I is less than 10. Now, again, this less than symbol is another example of an operator. We talked about operators a little bit in the last lesson. Equal sign is an operator, like we have here, equals 0. Equal is an operator. Not equal to, okay, we've shown how to do a not equal to null in the last lesson. So we had the percent sign, or the exclamation mark, and then equal. So when you have exclamation and equal, that means not equal. You'll learn that in Java, the exclamation mark is a not. It always means not. And just for the sake of showing you an example here, you could have also written this as I is less than or equal to 9. Okay, so I just put that here, but that's just to show you can write I is less than 10 or I is less than or equal to 9. Those actually mean the exact same thing. All right, now they mean the exact same thing because the value of I is an integer, and an integer can only have whole numbers. So saying less than 10 and less than or equal to 9 is the same thing because I can only be a whole number between, well, it can be between negative many thousands, tens of thousands, and all the way to positive tens of thousands. So there's only, that means that you can have these two meaning the exact same thing. If this was a double, meaning if it could contain decimal places, that means that there's a whole lot of values between the number 9 and 10 if there were decimals allowed. Because you can have 9.01, you can have 9.02, 9.03, 04, 05. You can even have 9.000001, 0002, 3, 4, you know what I mean? So you can have a lot of values between those if it was defined as a double. But it's not defined as a double. It's defined as an integer. This is why data types are very important. They play a very important role in a programming language. So that was just a little aside, just to describe that you could have written it in either of these two ways. They both do the same thing. Now, that is the end point. So we're saying we're starting at 0, and we're going all the way to I is less than 10, or I is less than or equal to 9. Then we define how we iterate. So when it comes to a for loop, you always want to make sure that you are iterating towards, you are making progress towards your end point. So if we start at 0, we have to find some way of telling it to go towards the end, which is 10 in this case. So the most common thing that we do in programming is to say I equals I plus 1. Okay? So what that's going to do is it's going to say for every time we iterate through this loop, we're going to be incrementing, this is called an incrementer, we increment I by 1. So we're taking the value of I, we're saying we want to set the value of I, we're going to set it equal to the current value of I, and we're going to add 1 to it. Okay, so it's going to take whatever is in I, add 1 to it, and then assign that entire thing back into the variable I. Okay, so it's pretty, some complex-ish stuff going on there if you've never seen this before. Curly bracket, and then we are going to do something inside. I guess we can define the scope of this as maybe ending right here. So this is the beginning of our for loop. We've already seen a whole bunch of stuff where we've applied the concept of a variable in there. We're using operators. We're using an incrementer here. We've learned about the syntax of a for loop and how you have a starting point, an ending point, and a way to iterate towards the ending point. So we're starting at 0. We're going to I is less than 10. So what can we do in here? Well, one thing that is typically done just to illustrate how these things work is to output to the console the value of I. So we're going to say system out print line, and we're going to print out the value of I to the console. So what is that going to look like? Let's draw our console window. We'll say we'll have a console window right here. And like so. And I put dash lines before for no apparent reason, so I guess I got to keep up with that. So what is this going to look like? What is the output going to be for this program? Well, it's going to start at I equals 0, and it's going to go all the way, incrementing by 1, towards I is less than 10, and it's going to print out the value of I to the console. So the first time, again, this is just lines of code, 1, 2, and 3. So there's only 3 lines of code here, but because we've made use of a for loop, because we were looping through code, it's actually going to do a lot more than 3 things. It's going to start with I equaling 0, because that's what's going to happen first. First, it's going to go in and instantiate the value of I. Okay, so it's going to start with I equals 0. Okay, and then it's going to check and see if I has hit the end of the for loop. I is less than 10. Is I, where it's 0, is 0 less than 10? Yes, it is. True. So remember when I said with control structures, it's sort of evaluating whether or not it's true or false. Well, this is what is happening inside of our for loop as well. It's just there's a lot of other stuff happening at the same time. But really, truly, all a for loop does is it checks to see if the overall expression is true or false. But the overall expression is always changing. So we starting with 0 is less than 10. Is 0 less than 10? True or false? Yes or no? True. 0 is less than 10. So because it's true, we're going to go inside of the control structure and execute the code. Remember, with control structures, if it evaluates to true in the round brackets, in the parentheses, then it will go ahead inside of the scope. Remember, we defined scope as being the curly brackets. It's going to go inside of the scope and it's going to execute that, whatever it is inside of the scope. If it evaluates to false, it's going to skip over. All right, so it evaluated to true, I, 0 at this point, is less than 10, true. So since you system.out.println I. What is the value of I right now? It's 0. So in the console, it's going to output 0. Cool. Then what's going to happen? Well, it's going to go down and it's going to say, all right, I know that inside of the scope of the scope that I'm inside of a for loop. So it's going to go back up. That's the whole point of a loop. It loops, right? It's going to loop over and over again. It's going to go back up. And it's going to execute the increment now. It's going to increment I equals I plus 1. So now I, since I is 0, I in this point is 0. So it's going to do 0 plus 1, and it's going to take the value of 0 plus 1 and assign it back into the value of I. So in other words, it's going to say I is no longer 0. It's going to assign I to be something different. It's going to be, what is 0 plus 1? 1. Okay, so now let me get rid of, well, it's going to be kind of messy. Let me see if I can do that. Cool. So now I equals 1. And then it's going to say, now it's incremented, it's going to go back to the ending check, and this is essentially the expression that's being evaluated. Is 1 less than 10 true or false? True. 1 is less than 10. So then it goes in, since it was true, it goes in and executes the stuff inside of the scope of the for loop. System out, println I. What is I? I is 1. So in the console, it outputs 1. And then it goes back and does the increment. What is the current value of I is 1 plus 1. It assigns it back into I. So now what is I equal to? For those of you who are astute, I is now equal to 2 because 1 plus 1 is 2. And then it goes in and it outputs system.out.println because, you know, we had evaluated the true here previously. So it's going to output 2 into the console. It's going to go back. I is now equal to 2. So 2 plus 1 is now 3. So it's going to go and it's going to, 3 is less than 10. Remember, it's going to go back and check and see if it's hit the end. 3 is less than 10 true, so it's going to go print out to the console, and so on and so forth. And you can see what's going to happen here. It's going to go to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So now I'm going to, the console output is going to go all the way to 9. 9 is going to, hit here. It's going to, I is equal to 9. Let me just sort of get rid of this right now. I is equal to 9, great. It's going to go down. It's going to loop back up again. I equals I plus 1 is what it's going to do. The iterator part of it, or the increment part of it. It's going to do iterate through and say 9 plus 1. So 9 plus 1 is what? 10, right? But then it's going to say, is 10 less than 10? And this is where the critical moment happens. The statement of is 10 less than 10, or remember, we are also, it's equivalent to saying 10 less than or equal to 9. Those are both the same in terms of I is less than equal to or I is less than. Same concept. Remember, I talked about having an integer and so on and so forth. Is 10 less than 10 or 10 less than or equal to 9? No. False. That is no longer the case. It was true when it was 9. Is 9 less than 10? Yes. Or is 9 less than or equal to 9? Yes, that's true. But as soon as it goes up to 10, boom, this is now no longer evaluating to true. So because that no longer evaluates to true, because 10 is not less than 10, 9 is less than 10, true, 10 is not less than 10, what's going to happen is it's going to skip out of the scope of this for loop and terminate, essentially, because there's nothing happening after this particular bracket. So it's going to terminate. No longer are we going to be inside of the loop anymore, and so to go on, well, it's going to terminate because there's no other code here, but if there was more code, it would go below line 3 and execute line 4, 5, 6, and so on and so forth. But because there's nothing else here, the program terminates. The output we have in our console is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have actually 10 numbers being outputted to our console, because if you count them out, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That is 10 iterations that have gone through. And we have outputted our numbers to the console. Cool, so even though I became 10 at some point because we incremented it, 10 is not less than 10, so it exited. I did go up to 10, but it never got outputted as 10 because it never hit the system out print line again, because 10 is not less than 10, so it evaluated false, exits the for loop, done and done. So that is an example of how for loops function inside of Java. Now, things that we can do differently there, let me just clear out my I iterations here. Things we can do differently is you can mess around with the starting point of the for loop. You could have done for, int I equals 1, where I is less than 11. I guess I put a little tail there, equals I plus 1. So that would do very much the same thing as this one. It's just that we're starting at 1 and going to less than 11 as opposed to 0 and 10. So the output to the console in this case, if we were to do the same code over here, copy and paste it, the console in this case would have gone from, started at 1, because we started at 1 with I, and then 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10. Okay, it still would have outputted 10 iterations, because this is still 10 iterations happening inside of here, but it would have outputted to the console 1 through 10 if we were doing the system out print line of I. Or, just to keep going with this, we don't have to do I equals I plus 1. We can do integer I equals, let's say 10, where I is greater than 0. Sorry, this should be a semicolon. And then we're incrementing, we're iterating by saying I equals I minus 1. So this is a different way to iterate through our for loop. Let's pretend that we have curly brackets here to assign scope, just to stay somewhat, syntactically correct. So look at this. We're starting at I equals 10. So the output for this guy is going to be starting at 10. And then we're saying I equals I minus 1. And then, so I equals I minus 1. Well, we start at 10. What is 10 minus 1? 10 minus 1 is 9. So essentially, we then increment down. We're going towards the end point. And the end is where I is greater than 0. So it's going to do 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Is 1 greater than 0? Yes, it is. 1 is greater than 0. So it's going to output 1. 1 minus 1 equals 0. Is 0 greater than 0? It's the same thing we were talking about before when we were saying 10 is less than 10. Is 10 less than 10? No. Is 0 greater than 0? Same thing, just reversed. No, 0 is not greater than 0, so it will terminate and it won't output 0. So it'll be 10 through to 1. Okay? So those are just different ways that you can increment and decrement from inside of our for loops. Another thing you can do in a for loop is you can do int, I equals, let's say, 0, where I is less than 10, and I, again, I forgot my tail on the I there, I is equal to I plus 2. So almost identical in terms of a statement. It's kind of a bad curly bracket. Almost identical to the one that we started with, I equals 0, I equals 0, I less than 10, I less than 10, I equals I plus 1, well, I equals I plus 2. So can you guess what this one is going to look like? Well, it's still going to start at 0, because we're starting at 0, and if, again, all of these for loops, I'm assuming we have this line of code, the system out print line, inside of the scope of the for loop. I'm making that assumption here. So if we assume that the system out print line is inside of this scope of the for loop, we're going to start at 0. and then we are going to do I equals I plus 2. So it's going to go from 0, and instead of going from 0 to 1, it's going to go 0 to 2. Okay? Because 0 plus 2 equals 2. So now I equals 2. Then you say is I less than 10? Is 2 less than 10? Yes. So it'll print out the 2. And then it's going to go back to the increment. 2 plus 2 is 4. Is 4 less than 10? Yes. And then it's going to output 4. And then it's going to come back up and say 4 plus 2 is 6. Is 6 less than 10? Yes. So it's going to execute our system out print line, which will output 6. And then it's going to go 6 plus 2 is 8. Is 8 less than 10? Yes. So it's going to output it. Boom. And it's going to go 8 plus 2 is 10. Is 10 less than 10? No, it's not. We talked about that over here. So that's how this one will end its termination. It will output 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. So instead of iterating 10 times, this one only iterates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. It executes half as much as the one before because we are doubling our rate of incrementing. Okay? So that just goes to show all the different iterations, all the different things that you can do with a for loop and how it affects the output. Now, whenever I learn this in university or whenever you learn this anywhere, you might say, okay, great, but when is it really going to be the case where you want to output these kinds of numbers onto a console? That's beside the point. That is not the point of this lesson is to teach you the concept of a for loop. Certainly a for loop, the majority of times in the real world, a for loop is going to look more or less like this. You're going to start probably at 0 or 1, and you're going to increment up to some sort of number. Typically, this number is either set. It's either set as, whatever it is that you want it to increment for. Like, ahead of time, you want to iterate 10 times over some sort of code. Who knows what the code does, but we want to iterate 10 times or 20 times or 30 times. And we put that number in there. Or there's another variable that we put in here. So there's a variable like, I don't know, max iterations or something like that. And the max iterations has a value that's stored inside of it. And then we use that as opposed to 10. We actually have a variable in place of the 10. So we're saying I is less than some sort of a variable. So the variable can change and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the real world scenarios that I see typically. That's when you see a for loop, is when you have some sort of a predefined number of times you want to iterate, and typically it starts at 0 and goes up until some sort of number, and it iterates over. Okay, by far that's the most common one. Very rarely do you see one that goes backwards. It can happen. There are situations when you'd want to do that, but it's a bit rare. So typically the most popular one is this one. And again, it's also rare to increment by anything other than 1. So typically incrementing by 2 or 3 or 4, or like I said, negative incrementing, it doesn't happen very often. It's typically this right here, I equals I plus 1. Having said that, the reason why I explain that is because this actually has a shorthand. I equals I plus 1 can be changed into I plus plus. These two things mean the exact same thing. I plus plus in the back end, once you compile it and everything, once Java does its magic, gets turned into I equals I plus 1. Same thing for I equals I minus 1, I minus minus. Okay, so these actually are shorthands, shortcuts that you can write because this, when it comes to programmers, what you're going to learn is programmers are lazy. So when we have something that we write out a lot, for example, I equals I plus 1, someone somewhere says, I'm tired of writing this, I'm going to make a shortcut for it because I write it out so much. So that's where I plus plus and I minus minus come from. Just a little aside there. Whenever you're writing for loops, you're typically going to see I plus plus or I minus minus. There you go. That is a good piece of information to know because I'm sure in the future, whenever I'm writing for loops, I'm going to be doing I plus plus or I minus minus, and you're going to be scratching your head saying, what does that mean again? Well, it means, I equals I plus plus or plus 1 or I equals I minus 1. It's just incrementing or, again, decrementing by 1 each and every time. Cool? And also for those of you watching on YouTube right now, again, I have a whole series of these videos that I give away for free. All you need to do is go to the link. I'll put it maybe right here above me. You can go to this link and sign up for my free course. I just need your email address and I'll be able to send you all of these lessons for free because I'm not going to be uploading all of them to YouTube. You're going to have to get into my sort of insider group, sign up for it, and get access to all of these great free tutorials from, again, yours truly, Trevor Page. I look forward to seeing you inside of this free Java course. Until next time, take care of yourself, happy learning, and bye for now.